All right, well, we'll go ahead and get started since we've got noon on the clock. It's our pleasure to welcome Dr. Nicole Karwowski to the Bair Ranch Seminar Series for the first one to kick us off this semester. And yeah, with that, floor is yours to take over.
Awesome. Good morning or good afternoon, I guess, everyone. It's wonderful to be here. Thanks so much for inviting me. I'm over in Linfield Hall in the Agricultural Economics and Economics Department. My work focuses on the intersection of economics, the environment, and agriculture. I'm open to interdisciplinary collaboration, so I'm excited to have this chance to tell you guys a little bit about what I do. Today, I'm going to be talking about how agriculture and different conservation efforts have been impacting water quality in the United States, as well as how we can maybe more effectively manage our surface waters in the future, trying to figure out what is a cost-effective way to balance some of the needs of agricultural producers with environmental quality. Okay, so quick overview of what I'm going to talk about. We're going to start with a quick look at water quality trends, especially thinking about how it's been regulated in the past. There's been a big distinction between how point sources, so like you can think about firms emitting versus non-point sources, have been treated by the regulators. We're going to talk about the role of agriculture and nutrient pollution in our surface waters. And then I'm going to finish off by talking about some of my work as well as others in the literature that have looked at how different agricultural policies or different types of conservation programs have been able to impact nutrient pollution and trying to tackle this issue. Okay, so quick beginning of like motivation. Currently, half of our country's surface waters fail to meet quality standards that are set by the Environmental Protection Agency. So these are standards for recreation, aquatic life, or as sources for drinking water. And a lot of economists have studied how this impacts human welfare. So we can see that this leads to production losses, especially for our fishery communities. It's also been tied to lower housing prices using different hedonic studies, lost recreation opportunities for fishermen, boaters, beachgoers, and then probably most notably, recently there's been a tie of surface water pollution and health outcomes, especially for infants, thinking of things like blue babies. Okay, so how have we tried to deal with this as a nation? So the biggest piece of legislation has been the Clean Water Act. This was passed in 1972, and it was largely focused on trying to stop the flow of emissions from point sources. So these are your factories, your construction companies, sewage treatment, different types of sand and gravel businesses, stormwater waste systems. So this is the Clean Water Act was focused on these types of firms. And fortunately, it led to really big increases in our water system. So we can see this Kaiser and Shapiro paper finds that the proportion of waters that are not fishable decreases from around 0.28 to 0.15%. Okay, so there's been large improvements because of the Clean Water Act. Okay, that's sort of the big takeaway. However, the Clean Water Act is notoriously the most expensive piece of environmental legislation in US history. So it has been led to $2 trillion of spending for this pollution abatement. So since 1960, we can see sort of the trends in how personally industrial companies have been spending to try to slow down their water pollution, as well as the costs imposed on municipal organizations. If we break down that $2 trillion, that can be thought of as $140 per person per year since 1960 to today, or over $35 billion total per year. So what do I want y'all to take away from this figure is the Clean Water Act worked, but it was very, very, very costly, okay? So we've seen that there are these reductions in point source pollutants. Now the tide is turning and the attention is sort of on the agricultural producers, or you can think about these as the non-point source emitters. So what's the difference? So it's a lot harder to trace nutrients on land than coming out from one point of a firm, right? So it's been a lot harder to tackle this issue. In 2023, agriculture made up around $1.5 trillion of GDP, around 5% of the pie, but it has a hugely disproportional impact on our land. So 40% of our land are going towards agriculture, okay? And why are we seeing these nutrient issues? Well, crop production systems inherently rely on things like fertilizers, pesticides, herbicides in order to produce their crop. Like that's how we grow these plants. These are a necessary input to get the yields that we need in order to create sustainable food plants, right? In the livestock production side of things, manure is also an inevitable byproduct of this type of industry, right? And it's okay when these nutrients, these fertilizers and pesticides stay on the land. The issue becomes when we have high runoff events. So you can think about if you're getting a spring storm or snow melt and you've just applied your fertilizer and these nutrients run off into our surface waters. And that's when things get hairy, okay? So this excess nutrient pollution has been linked to the hypoxic Gulf in Mexico. That's led to fish kills. I've talked a little bit about some of the health and economic impacts. So this is sort of the issue that we're faced with. In Montana specifically, it's around 53% of river miles and 72% of lake acres have been listed as impaired in the most recent study done by the Department of Environmental Quality. And they also point out that the biggest cause of this seems to be from agriculture, mainly from grazing on riparian zones, as well as through irrigated crop production. So the science has shown that there's this link between crop production and nutrient pollution in our waters. So what are we supposed to do about it? So currently the Clean Water Act and federal regulation doesn't try to solve this non-point source pollution problem. We've seen that this type of top-down approach where you're going to have regulation, forest permitting, seems to work, but it's very, very, very costly, okay? So what we've been doing in the ag space instead is trying to focus on a sort of carrot approach, if you will, rather than this stick approach. So a lot of the incentives trying to tackle nutrient pollution from the ag side are incentive programs, okay, or like subsidized policy levers. But do these work? That's sort of the question that I'm interested in asking. So the current reduction strategies, we can sort of separate into three different approaches. One is this land retirement space, so programs that you may be familiar with that are from the USDA, the Agricultural Conservation Easement Program, or it was previously known as the Wetland Reserve Program. Things like the Conservation Reserve Program have been designed with an effort to try to take land out of production in order to provide some of these ecosystem services, such as water quality. And these are the two main programs that I'm going to talk about today. There's also been some work done on different working land programs, such as the Environmental Quality Incentive Program, CSP or CPP. There's been studies on how things like cover crops and these different sustainable agricultural practices impact water quality. There's also this like weaker sort of compliance branch. This is more dealing with things like wetland uses, but if you drain a wetland, you can lose your farm bill support payments or be ineligible for crop insurance assistance. But this branch is a lot less of a focus compared to the dollars that have been invested in land retirement and some of these working land programs. Okay, so that was my motivation. Here's sort of the main focus of today's talk. I'm going to be investigating how these land retirement programs like easements or the Conservation Reserve Program impact nutrient pollution in United States surface waters. I'm going to be focusing on the Mississippi River Basin, which makes up 40% of the United States. Specifically, I'm going to be looking at whether changes in acreage in this program lead to reductions in nutrient pollution at the subwatershed level. So the United States is broken down into hydrological unit codes with HUC2s all the way going to HUC12s. So I'm looking at within these HUC12s, these broader spaces, are we seeing changes from these types of programs? I'm going to be looking at, I will talk about work that I have done on the Wetland Reserve Program, as well as the Conservation Reserve Program. There's two other studies that I'm going to tie in on cover cropping and EQIP. And then at the end of this talk, I'm going to compare the costs and benefits of these types of programs. So how much money have we invested and how much are we getting out of these programs? Any questions thus far? Also feel free, so in Econ Land, I should have mentioned this earlier, you can interrupt whenever you want. You can ask a question at any point. So I won't be offended if you needed clarification or if you have a concern. Okay, let's jump into the first paper that I'm going to talk about called Nature's Kidneys, the role of wetland reserve easements in restoring water quality. This is joint work with Dr. Marion Skidmore, who's at the University of Urbana-Champaign. So what is a wetland easement? Basically, this has been a program that's been around since 1990, and it pays land producers to retire their land from production. They get to keep the land, they can recreate on it. A lot of people will hunt ducks and stuff like that on it. They get to keep paying taxes on the land. What they're giving up is the right to crop or to have livestock. So basically, the government is paying you to stop farming on that land, and you're going to get a lump sum payment. You're usually going to see around $3,000 per acre to join this kind of easement program. I think around 0.01% of land in the United States is in this program. And so what happens then, this is a program that's directed by the Natural Resource Conservation Service. They go in on that land and then they're going to convert it into its original wetland state. So to be eligible for this program, the land that you're cropping or farming on has to have been previously a wetland, and they can tell this because of historical maps as well as sort of like the soil quality and stuff. But the NRCS goes in, they put in native species, they might remove some of the tiling, build different topographical features like berms, anything they can do to direct the water back onto that land to make it a functioning wetland, okay? Wetlands, the title of this paper is Nature's Kidneys. They're sort of famous for their ability to filter the waters, especially when it comes to nutrients, especially when it comes to nitrogen. So they have different types of plants and microbes. I'm not an ecologist, so bear with me on the science part of this, but they have these special powers of being able to turn these nutrients into less harmful substances. The plants will also use up and sort of soak up some of these excess nutrients and keep it from further traveling downstream into the rest of our surface waters. Okay, so are there any wetland easements in Montana? So around 60% of land in Montana is used for agricultural production, and there's around 30,000 of these wetland easements in Montana, which is only 0.5% of land in Montana is in this ASEP program. So it's a very small share of land that is being retired, okay? I'm doing this study that was a quick snapshot of what things look like in Montana. I'm going to be looking at the entire Mississippi River Basin. And so here's a quick map of surface water readings for ammonia. This is actually at the Huck 8 level. Huck 12s are usually around 24,000 acres, so they're very small. So it's hard to get a sense of water quality trends, but I'm going to be looking at this area for this study. I mentioned doing this analysis at the Huck 12 level, and we have data going all the way back to 1985 to 2018. And we're also going to be focusing on specifically the sub-watersheds that have ever enrolled in this program. So you could think about doing a comparison of units that are in WRP versus the ones that have never been in WRP. But maybe those are inherently different. Maybe that is not a good control group because those are going to have different water quality trends in the first place. So the economist is sort of like, well, let's only look at changes in these sub-watersheds that have wetland easements. A quick talk about the data that I'm using. So I create a panel data set. The main outcome variables that I'm going to be using come from SNAPT, which is a version of the water quality data portal. So this is a huge data set that's been going back all the way from the 1980s, but a bunch of different government agencies have been monitoring water quality at different sites over time. And so what Krasovich and his team at the EPA do is they're going to make those monitor level readings comparable across time and space. So this has been a really big boon for those in the water quality world. It's a lot easier to now understand how water quality has changed over time. I'm going to be looking at ammonia and phosphorus. The N and the P is usually the biggest outcomes that we see. These also are linked with the biggest costs, so that's why I'm focusing on those nutrients. I've worked with the NRCS in the past to get access to their contract level data. These are also available as shapefiles publicly, so we're able to tell exactly where these wetland easements are on the landscape, as well as when the contract closed and when the wetland was restored. So I'm interested in looking at, after that wetland is considered restored, how are changes, what is happening to the nutrient levels in that subwatershed. We're also going to be using different land cover data sets. Specifically, we use LC-MAP, which is from the USGS, and it goes all the way back to 1985, which is why we picked that one over something like the NLCD or CDL. And then we're also going to control for precipitation and temperature in that year month, because it can have a big impact on your surface water quality levels. Okay, so here's a quick look at some summary statistics. How many observations am I working with? So there's over 173,000 in my entire sample. And then when I'm focusing on just your ever treated group, which I think is going to give me a better causal measurement of how these wetland easements work, and we're going to have closer to 18,000 observations. The average ammonia and phosphorus levels are 0.13, 0.15 milligrams per liter. So you can keep that summary statistic in your mind when we're looking at the magnitude of these effects later on. On average, a subwatershed has around 30 acres of these wetland easements. For the ever treated, it's going to be closer to 250 acres of wetland easements. Most projects are usually around 100 acres in size, to give you an idea of sort of like how big an increase in treatment is. And we're also going to be looking at whether there are any downstream effects. So we look at the effect of the upstream wetlands that have been restored. We use the National Hydrology data set to sort of tie HUCs through space. Here is my linear regression model that I'm using to try to unearth this effect. So basically what I'm doing is looking at how are changes in wetland easement land share going to impact our nutrient outcomes. So that's going to be my dependent variable, is going to be those ammonia and phosphorus readings. And I'm looking at, within a subwatershed, how are changes in wetland easements associated with changes in nutrient concentration. And I'm not sure how familiar you are with fixed effects in this field, but basically I'm controlling for trends within the broader HUC-8. So the idea is you're only going to be comparing units within the same sort of area. And then I'm also controlling for year fixed effects. So that is going to account for changes in like national crop prices that might also be driving some of these trends in water quality. And also I'm going to be controlling for seasonality, because there's big differences in water quality readings based on whether they were taken in the summer or the fall. So this is like taking out variation that I don't think is, that I think it might be conflating with wetland easements. Does that sort of make sense, this kind of approach? Okay, happy to keep talking about regressions. Okay, what do I find? Well, so we find that increasing restored wetland acres within a subwatershed is going to lower your ammonia levels, not so much for phosphorus. So it seems that these wetland easements are much better at tackling ammonia issues or nitrogen issues rather than sort of phosphorus. How can you interpret this table? What is this IHS stuff? So basically that's sort of like taking the log. So I'm interpreting it as a percent change. So how I have it modeled is a 100% increase in wetland acres within a subwatershed is going to reduce your ammonia levels by 6 to 8%. Same with those wetland easements that are upstream, you're actually going to see very similar sized effects in those subwatersheds that are downstream. Why do we think we're finding ammonia effects and not phosphorus effects? So I've talked to some hydrologists, I've talked to some wetland ecologists, and I really do think it has to do with sort of how the wetland functions. And phosphorus, you can think about it as being sort of like, oftentimes it's more so tied with like sediments, and it's a lot heavier. So when it gets in the wetland, it doesn't get transformed versus these ammonia and nitrogen nutrients are actually undergoing these microbial and plant processes that are getting rid of the ammonia in the water. We do some heterogeneity analysis and we find that we do see some decreases in phosphorus during certain times of the year or during heavy precipitation events. But on average, which is what economists are usually interested in, we're not seeing really big movers in phosphorus from these wetland easements. Fortunately, though, they seem to be really good at reducing ammonia levels from the system. To give you an idea of like the scale, so like increasing restored wetland easements by 250 acres in a 24,000 acre kind of space is going to reduce water quality. It's going to improve water quality measured by ammonia by 6%. So this is a really small like change in your treatment for a pretty good bang for your buck when we're looking at such a large area, which is pretty exciting to see. A lot of the previous literature has sort of focused on like much closer like field level studies or looking like directly next to the surface waters of these wetland easements. You of course see improvements in water quality, but the contribution here is that we're seeing these broad level changes in water quality as well. Okay, so to sort of conclude this first paper, we find evidence that retiring a small amount of land and putting it into a wetland easement leads to water quality improvements within the watershed. We find that increasing wetland easements by, that should be 250 acres or 100%, reduces ammonia levels by 6 to 8%. And we're seeing that that trend continues in the areas that are downstream. We also look at some different heterogeneity analysis, and we find larger impacts in places that have more agricultural activity going on within the watershed, as well as more development. So this makes sense intuitively. When there's more nutrients in that area, we're seeing wetlands are filtering more nutrients. We do sort of a back of the envelope calculation, and we look at, okay, we know that ammonia levels are changing by 6%. And we look at what are the costs for some of these drinking water facilities when it comes down to their water filtration. Like, how much does it cost to filter out additional ammonia from our waters? And so we take that 6% change in water quality, and we find that that can be linked to about a $17,000 change per facility in terms of reducing sort of the costs of running your operations. So we do a quick cost benefit analysis in this paper. Okay, any wetland questions before I jump into conservation reserve program? Yes.
Yeah, a question on you're measuring nitrogen as ammonia as a compound and phosphorus
Yes.
as an element. Why not measure phosphate? So you're on a element or nitrogen itself. So you're why did you swap from an element to a compound?
Yes.
in your metric?
Good question. I don't have this table in the figure, but we do try to do phosphates And we do try to do total nitrogen, and it's just sort of like the data availability of like what people were measuring. So we have a lot of ammonia readings, not a lot of nitrate readings. So our observation size just like gets decimated when we try to look at some of those other types of outcomes. But these are also like pretty standard in the literature to look at ammonia versus nitrogen. We do have some appendix tables looking at total nitrogen, and we do find some decreases, but usually they're not statistically significant. And I just think we're underpowered in some of those cases.
So if you broke ammonia down just by molecular weight, would you expect to see the same amount? They're saying statistical groupings?
So like if we converted the ammonia measurements into N instead, that's something we could try. We could definitely try that. What is your name?
My name is Hayes Newsom.
Hayes Newsom.
Yeah.
Thank you, Hayes,
Yeah.
for your question and comment. Yes.
From a policy standpoint, this wetlands program, you had a slide that said perhaps permanent or in perpetuity.
Yes.
It doesn't expire on like 10, 12-year contracts like a lot of CRP.
No, I should have highlighted this, but wetland easements are permanent. They last forever, and these contracts have held up in court. Like even if the land exchanges ownership, sometimes people will try to exit out of an easement contract and you can't. Like these things are forever. Good question. So different than the CRP kind of rental model. And we also think that these benefits are probably growing over time, which is exciting to see. Like as the wetland becomes a better wetland, it does a better job of filtering. We have a spin-off paper trying to understand how wetlands in isolation work versus wetlands that are connected to sort of the water quality networks, which has sort of policy relevance for things like the Sackett versus EPA court case of like which wetlands are worth protecting. Do these ones that are isolated seem to be making any of these ecosystem service benefits, or do they have to be tied to the surface waters? That's something that we're also interested in sort of further exploring. And that's our next paper. Keep an eye out for it.
Got a question. When you were doing your budget breakdown,
Yeah.
did you try to estimate the production value of the lands that were being put in the easements?
This is such a great segue to another paper that I have that looks specifically at like foregone yield. Fortunately, unfortunately, I only use data in Wisconsin. So I work with a remote sensing guy who creates like these raster maps of yields in Wisconsin of corn and soybeans. And then I look at, okay, when you put a wetland easement in, what were the average yields on those lands previously? And they're usually very marginal lands, like it's your crappy land that producers are putting into this program. So you're not losing off, like producers aren't losing a lot in terms of like foregone production, because these places are usually like not like they flood often. They can see, another paper I have looks at sort of like indemnity losses. And you actually find that like you see lower risk for agricultural producers that use things like wetland easements because you're not seeing those losses on these marginal lands. And actually, like the best part of the paper is these wetland easements like have a flooding impact. And so you actually see improved yields in the radius around these wetlands for corn, not soybeans. But I can share that paper with you. Yeah. Great question. Okay. Let's go ahead and switch gears to talking about conservation reserve program. Marin is also on this paper. My colleagues from the Economic Research Service at the USDA, Aaron and Andrew, are also collaborators on this project, and they have allowed us to access the Conservation Reserve Program contract level data, which is really exciting. And we're able to basically do sort of a similar analysis as the one that I just walked through, but now instead of looking at wetland easements, we're going to be looking at the CRP. So we talked about WRP. It's a much smaller program. 0.01% of land is under these wetland easements versus CRP is the largest voluntary private conservation program in the United States. It's a runner-up for the biggest conservation program in the world. The US spends approximately $2 billion per year on this program, and it makes up around 1% of land in the continental United States. For those of you unfamiliar with this program, it's basically like a rental contract. So you promise the USDA Farm Service Agency that you're not going to crop on your land that was previously in agricultural production for 10 to 15 years, and you get a rental payment on that land. Why are people doing this? The big sort of driver of this program was to help with soil erosion issues. It's also been touted for improving some of the ecosystem services. Sort of like a side effect of this program has been water quality, but we're going to study to what extent is that true. So you can think about the CRP as working in sort of two different ways. One is through the general program. So you can think about that as like the traditional CRP of like you're taking these bigger fields and retiring them from production. Okay, so that's more like the land retirement take. More popular now is the continuous program. So you can think about this more of like a working lands type of program. But you're going to be adopting different conservation practices like perennial grasses, riparian buffers, filter strips, a little bit of wetlands. And so what we're going to ask is, do these two different programs have a different impact? Are we seeing that CRP is helping us solve this nutrient pollution issue? Here's a quick look at Montana enrollment. To the next slide, actually. So Montana has always been a big enroller in CRP, but we can, the peak was in 2006 with about 3.5 million acres of land in the program, but that's been steadily decreasing as things like the national acreage cap decrease, as your opportunity costs increase. So there's been a lot, as there's also been sort of a change in the priority areas. So traditionally, CRP was all about the general sign-up practice, and this is where Montana is a big player, these whole field adoption of CRP. But in the most recent decade, we're seeing this sort of transition to this continuous type of program. Where is continuous CRP? We're seeing it in a lot more of like the Corn Belt states. So like these highly productive lands, the North Dakota, South Dakota areas, we're also seeing like those are the places that CRP is enrolling in. In effect, we're seeing less land in general. So sort of like acres from general are sort of shifting, going towards this continuous type of program. So that means a lot less CRP in Montana. And when we're looking at change from 2008 to 2022. Okay, so what do I do in this study? So my co-authors and I, we're going to do something similar. We're looking at how land share in the CRP. So we look at the share of agricultural acreage within the subwatershed impacts nutrient levels in the Mississippi River Basin. So that's that big swath of land. That includes about half of Montana. This study, we don't have a big of a panel. It only goes back to the year 2000 instead of 1985. And that's largely because of CRP data availability. Before 2000, like the CRP contract level data just becomes a nightmare. So we don't really trust it going back that far. But when we're during these 2 decades, we feel very confident that we're able to tie these CRP contracts to the subwatersheds that they belong in. We're going to use the same water quality data set, that SNAPT one, that has measures of ammonia and phosphorus. A little bit more insight on that SNAP data set. So I think there's like 30 different potential variables that you can use. And we pick the ones, I think for this study, we also pick nitrogen just because of the availability is much better. And then as I mentioned previously, we are also able to distinguish between contracts in the general program versus the continuous program. So here is our model. It looks very similar. where the outcome of interest is going to be the nutrient levels in terms of milligrams per liter of ammonia, nitrogen, and phosphorus. We're looking at the percentage of subwatershed ag land. The denominator here is agricultural land in 1985, so we're keeping that fixed, and we're looking at if there's a change in the numerator for CRP enrollment as a share of the ag land, how is this going to be changing our nutrient levels? We also control for upstream water quality at times as a control, and then we have the same controls as previously, temperature, rainfall. This time we also control for a commodity price index that's at the county level. And we're going to be looking at trends within the subwatershed itself, as well as more broadly within the bigger watershed, as sort of like your units of comparison. Okay, so what do we find? If you increase CRP, the percent of agricultural land, this is where we actually see decreases in phosphorus. So you remember wetlands didn't lead to big changes in phosphorus, but we're seeing that the CRP seems particularly well suited to tackling the phosphorus nutrient pollution issue. We're not seeing anything on nitrogen, but there is maybe some evidence that CRP is going to reduce your ammonia levels in your subwatershed. How can you sort of convert this into an acres per to percentage change? So we find that a 100 percentage point increase in CRP, so that's going to be around 13,000 acres, decreases your phosphorus levels by 0.02 to 0.03%. So that's very, very small. So like we are seeing some significant effect, but these seem to be very small effects. Okay. We also look at what happens downstream, and there seems to be some evidence that these water quality benefits are continuing on into the subwatersheds that are directly below it. We're seeing reductions in phosphorus and ammonia there as well. We also break it down by general and continuous. Note that now we don't get to see that movement in ammonia, but we are seeing some evidence that general and continuous both have an impact in decreasing those phosphorus levels, and continuous seems to have a higher impact. So if we converted that into a percentage point change, increasing general land acreage by 1,200 acres reduces phosphorus levels by 0.2%, versus a 300-acre change in continuous land in CRP leads to much bigger reductions in phosphorus of 16%. So we find that it's these continuous like edge of field practices that seem to be much better at helping sort of like stop that nutrient runoff from getting into the surface waters versus which is also good for producers, right? So that you don't have to enroll an entire field within the CRP to see these changes in nutrient problems. Instead, it's like these really targeted practices that are making a difference in water quality. So land retirement is not probably the way to go because we're seeing really small benefits compared to maybe some of these continuous practices is where we're getting the bang for our buck, is sort of my takeaway from this table. Okay. The last CRP kind of thing that we do is we're looking for different effects by HUC2. So what is the HUC2? So remember, the United States is cut up into these types of basins, and we look at, for the MRB, where are we seeing these impacts being driven by? And we find that these seem to be the largest in HUC10 and HUC11. And where is that? That's the Missouri Basin, as well as the Arkansas white-red basin is where we're seeing these. If you overlap it, this is for the range folks, with a map of rangelands in the United States, it seems that this area is seeing a lot of the benefits in water quality from CRP. Okay, so sort of where we're concluding with this paper is we're seeing that the CRP does have an impact on nutrient levels, but it seems to be very small, okay? It's the continuous acres that have a bigger impact. We're also seeing differences in impact by nutrient type. It seems that phosphorus is the one that's really being impacted by CRP versus wetlands seem to be much better at reducing nitrogen. Where are we seeing these benefits? It looks like the HUC 10 and HUC 11 are the places where we're seeing that these are the most effective. Okay, a quick look at some of the other studies that have been done in the space. This paper by Say and Gramig looks at cover crop adoption, and they're using sort of similar methods, but they find that increasing cover crops by 200 acres is going to reduce your nitrogen levels by 2%. And they see that these effects are the biggest between fall harvest and spring planting. So cover crops seem to have an impact. They seem to be more tackling the N types of nutrients. There's also a paper looking at equip, which is more like different types of investments that producers use versus these like kind of working lands or land retirement. Like this is more about like something like fencing animals out of riparian areas. It's sort of like what the equip program does. I sort of don't like this study as much, but they do find that there are some benefits to nitrogen levels, that if you spend $60,000 of equip money in a sub-watershed, you're going to see lower nitrogen levels, but you see increases in your phosphorus levels. And they make a claim that like, well, a lot of these projects, you have to like till up the land. And so that's going to cause like some runoff of sediments and stuff. And they do their studies at a much smaller scale within 10 miles of equip contracts. And they focus on things like a little bit like the cover crops that we just talked about, as well as different types of tillage practices and different types of livestock and waste management strategies. They don't what I would have loved to see is like by practice versus instead of just like equip dollars. But okay, let's get to where I'm trying to go, which is trying to understand the costs and benefits of these different types of programs. These practices are expensive, and Gary Schnitke has a paper that finds that if you look at producers' bottom lines, these practices are not increasing your yields usually, and they're increasing your costs. Okay, so these have to be subsidized in order for producers to adopt a lot of these. About how much does it cost on average? So CRP nationally will give you about $80 per year to do general or, I should have broken that by general and continuous. I think continuous is a little more expensive. Wetland easements, we talked about being a $3,000 per acre cost. Cover crop adoption varies in terms of cost. It can be around $50 to $80 per acre nationally. It'll be a little bit lower and less expensive for those in Montana. And equip really depends on the practice. It was harder to break this down into sort of a dollar per acre. The annual payment for a contract is around $1,500 to $80,000. Okay, so I've gathered these cost data. I've looked at the literature to try to understand the water quality benefits. So then what I'm going to do is sort of like a back of the envelope and look at like, okay, if I had $100,000 and I spent it on these different types of initiatives, what would we see in terms of changes in ammonia, nitrogen, and phosphorus? So you'll recall for the wetland easement programs, we're seeing reductions in ammonia, and we're seeing an insignificant change in phosphorus. For CRP, we are seeing decreases in ammonia and phosphorus, but very, very small ones. Cover cropping seems to be good at reducing nitrogen levels. Equip, also good at nitrogen levels, not great with phosphorus. So sort of like, what is my takeaway from sort of this talk, from this paper, is nutrient pollution is complicated, and there doesn't seem to be sort of one practice or one policy that is going to be the solution. It seems like we need to have sort of a menu of options, if you will, and really target the lands that are leading to the biggest sources of runoff and the biggest problems, And just taking out like little bits of land can help us, I think, fix or mitigate some of the costs of water pollution. So sort of broad level takeaways. So remember, I started this talk talking about the Clean Water Act, one of the biggest environmental expenditures in the United States. And that is this really top-down, broad-level approach. And sort of what I'm interested in seeing as an economist is, are there other types of policy, like these sort of subsidized sticks, that might be able to get us to better water quality in a more cost-effective way instead? That's sort of the story that I'm trying to tell. I do think more research needs to be done here. I think it would be especially interesting to try to get maybe better data on some of these water quality outcomes. Something else I'm interested in doing is trying to really identify which lands we should be targeting to see the biggest benefits per dollar. That's all I have for y'all today. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you. Does any of your data look at changes in wildlife populations following this improvement, like fish or birds?
That would be super interesting. I'm not as familiar with sort of like those kind of wildlife population data, but it could be definitely something that you could pair with some of these conservation practices. I think that would be super interesting to do. I think those, like the studies that I've seen done on those are usually a lot smaller. So it'd be interesting to see what data exists at maybe like these broader level to try to understand maybe these bigger trends. Would be super interesting. Maybe the Cornell data set, like, would be one place to, they have bird watching data set. I think it's eBird. So it's like the citizen science kind of app. And they log in the birds that they see. So you could do, and I think that is like a pinpoint of a spot. And so I have seen, oh, actually this jogs the memory. There is one paper out there, it's not published, it's a working paper that looks at conservation reserve program and grassland bird species abundance and diversity. And they see increases in both of those. So I can try to, I think it's Chen-Ti Chen is the first author on that paper. Might be worth checking out. I think there was someone back here. No? Okay, maybe it was.
In my previous life, I used to do quite a bit of work with cattle and streams. And we were talking about the federal clean water
Yes.
and the 308 list. Most of the streams, as I understand it, don't meet those standards primarily because of temperature.
Because of what?
Of temperature.
Okay.
And I was wondering, you guys have been dealing with this data quite a bit. One of the things that's confusing for cattlemen and landowners is while everyone's worried about nutrients in the water, there's also programs out there, and one that comes to mind is the Threatened Endangered Species Act, where they've had a lot of the streams in the west, particularly the Intermountain region and the Rockies, is nutrient deficient. So we have one federal agency trying to get us to reduce nutrients, and another agency trying to add nutrients. For instance, for Chinook salmon, we were dumping hatchery waste in critical areas for salmon spawning to increase nutrients for fish. So how do we balance some of these things?
I think that's go.
You always really want nitrogen to go down.
I think you're asking a really great question, and I feel like this is something that, like, my particular methods are really good at understanding changes at the average, right? And so that can be good because we can understand maybe these big changes like over decades and nationally or for really big areas. But what we're losing out on is these nuances between like site level or at the parcel level or at the stream level. Maybe there are really big differences, right? So there could be areas that need more or less different types of nutrients. how could you do this kind of a study while keeping that in mind? I would maybe try to like overlay a map of sort of like areas that are resource like deficient and try to see maybe changes in the water that maybe is deficient, like trying to break it down a little bit and looking at these specific areas, the types of trends that we're seeing there. And I feel like this might be a better thing, or like as an economist, I don't think that's my comparative advantage. I think like I would want to work with ecologists and hydrologists to try to really tackle that question. Really so like, I guess like the caveat here is like, these are broad level trends over really big spaces, right? So of course, there's going to be differences across the landscape.
I think to Tim's point, location and goal.
Yes.
You know, like,
Yeah.
For years, we've generally figured that nitrogen in freshwater systems, you know, there's not a toxicity, except when you get to drinking water, yes, but
Yes.
in the system usually.
Yeah.
But when that nitrogen-rich water gets to the Gulf of Mexico,
Yes.
that nutrient's the limiting factor for eutrophication. Of course, that harms commercial and sport fisheries in the Gulf of Mexico,
Yes.
but then,
Headwaters.
you know, but then it might make a nice fishery downstream from someplace in Montana.
Right.
But
And
then
then,
it gets into a stock pond and you'll have eutrophication and harmful algal blooms.
yes. So I think that's sort of one motivation for trying to understand ammonia a little bit, because that one has been linked to being like, this is directly toxic to fish populations. And like too much ammonia will break down their cells. And it's sort of like the most potent, most dangerous type of N. While you're correct, N in itself doesn't have like these direct environmental impacts. It's really through that eutrophication channel where we can see the potential damages occur, right? So like being super mindful about, maybe this is something that I could have done better, is being like, what do I mean when I say nutrient pollution, right? Like that can mean a number of things, like where, like, because they can have different impacts depending on what it is, right? Yeah. Yes. Haze, right?
Haze, yeah. I was thinking something that might go well with your regressions is precipitation.
I have those.
You have those in there, okay?
Yes, they are at the month-year level. I don't show the coefficients here, but they're in the paper.
Okay,
I also control for average temperature
Sure.
in that, yeah, but great point. I also see, I wish I had more time, but I interact sort of the wetland impacts and the CRP impacts by months that have a lot of precipitation. And that's usually where we see the biggest impacts. So like, that's when we're seeing the nutrients move around the most. So
remind me, what was the difference between CRP and continuous CRP?
yes, so like general versus kind of continuous. So there's a few differences in enrollment. So for general, you have to enter into this auction and it's sort of a lot harder to get in. You're ranked on your environmental benefits index. There's different sort of criteria to be allowed into this program. And then continuous, and this is usually more like entire fields that are being retired. Who's in general, it's usually like older farmers who are close to retiring. They don't want to do, they're sort of easing back how much work they're doing on the land. So they just are putting it into CRP, and it's this sort of like chill way of getting a rental payment. So it's been used to sort of like provide like a nice income stream for some of these older farmers. Versus continuous is more like these edge of field practices that we're seeing in places that have much higher agricultural productivity. And it's going to be like much smaller areas of land. It's not like your entire field, but like doing a little riparian buffer by this thing. So
I think you pointed out some of it with the areas of higher productivity.
yes,
Where general CRP is more landscape level based on that. Generally, in some of these cases, in places like Montana, the annual precipitation isn't high enough to keep those fields profitable.
yes,
So put back. out of cropping system into something that's more of a general, long-term, stable system. That, and back in with the, back to the ammonia versus nitrate versus phosphate, and then the precipitation too. And I understand you have to use what data you get, but when we look at in terms of leaching potential, you know, nitrogen is far, nitrate especially is highly more leachable in soils to groundwater based on the charge. It's a negative charged. And generally, organic matters in soils are positively charged. And so as organic matter drops, the actual holding capacities in the soils differ based on whether it's an ammonia positive or a nitrate negative, but they're both carrying nitrogen with it. So I'm wondering how, and again, the data may not be there, but how do you see developing models based on what essentially the charge of the compound in the soil and the leaching potentials and how that ends up in the groundwater, whereas compared to phosphorus, phosphate are very stable in soils. They bond very well tightly in the soil, so they don't move. So how are you supposed to differentiate nitrate, positive versus negative in the soils, your models, and kind of back to Tim's question, what do we tell people to do?
Okay, this is a not an easy question. So I think okay, so if I understand your question correctly, it's sort of like, how do we take into account that these nutrients have different relationships with the soil and with the water, right? Well, that's something that we can directly look at, right? Like 4 places that we have those outcomes available. And we try to do that a little bit with the CRP paper of like, how are trends in nitrogen versus ammonia different, right? And we're not really seeing significant changes in nitrogen from some of these practices. So that might be because of exactly some of those reasons that you've stated about, and I'm less familiar with this, but like just the ions, maybe the ions are why we don't see these nitrogen changes and why we do see these ammonia changes. Like, I think I have to do some of my homework here of like really understanding why we're seeing these different nutrient level trends and trying to see like the nitrogen cycle, you know, like what is going on there.
Yeah, no, I'm just curious with that, because a lot of time when ammonia hits the soil, it's converted to nitrate too, fairly quickly with soil microbes. And so that's, so
My understanding is it can still take a few months, right? So like if there's a rainfall event, like it can, that's when it will go into the surface waters, right?
or, well, depending, I mean, again, yeah, so a lot of variables. Also, that, you know, hard pan layer, there's a lot of things that influence that, which I understand. Complexities of it, I was just trying to get some parallel out.
Well, it looks like we're at about time. I'll let you guys go. Thank you again for having me here. I'm happy to chat afterwards, or if you want to shoot me an email. I'd love to learn more about you guys. Thank you.
Okay.